Hello and welcome to the India launch of the 2022 Reuters Institute Digital News Report. My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and professor of political communication. And what I'll do today is to share a few highlights from the global work that we do in the Digital News Report, highlight some of the key differences between India and the other markets that we cover, and then really look forward to the panel discussion with the editors and journalists who are joining us here today. So the Reuters Institute Digital News Report is the world's largest ongoing publicly available study of news and media use across the world. We cover 46 markets and 6 continents with about 2,000 respondents in each of the countries that we cover. I should stress here that it's an online survey, and in particular in India, the respondents are English language internet users, so not representative of the whole Indian public or even of Indian internet users, but still, while a small minority, an important and interesting part of the Indian market, and perhaps something that gives us some sense of developments in India and how they compare with other parts of the world. The Digital News Report is made possible by our network of sponsors, which include media organizations such as the BBC, media regulators in different countries such as Ofcom, as well as foundations such as the Open Society Foundations and a large grant from the Google News Initiative. This year is the 11th edition of the report, and it really gives us, I think, a chance to think about what are some of the larger trends we're seeing in our media environment over time. We don't have that data for India, but I think it gives us an angle also on developments that may become relevant in the Indian context as well. And one of the things we are seeing really, if we look, for example, the United States, is a really interesting phenomenon where while it's clear that digital media are very important and social media has become more important over time, even as television and print has declined in importance, we actually see by now a slightly more sort of silent development where a growing minority of people who are internet users and have access to news aren't actually using any of these options of accessing news on a regular basis. So in the United States, for example, over the last 10 years, the number of people who say they use none of these options to access news has grown from 3% to 15% in the last year. And part of the reason might be that what we're seeing in many markets that we cover is essentially a declining interest in news. We ask people about how interested they would say they are in the news, and the percentage of people who say that they're very or somewhat interested in the news has really declined quite sharply in a number of markets across the world, down from about 3/4 or 2/3 in these markets to half or even less than half saying that they are very or somewhat interested in the news. There are other countries where the figures are more stable, but still we see some declines in interest in news in many markets across the world. And it's not just interest that's declining, it's also an increase in parallel with selective news avoidance, where by now, up from 29% in 2019, in 2022 in our report, 38% of our respondents said they often or sometimes actively try to avoid the news. Figures are particularly high in a few markets such as Brazil and the UK, but actually amongst our respondents in India, the figures are quite high there too. Actually, 43% of our respondents in India say that they often or sometimes actively try to avoid the news. And I think for editors and journalists, it's interesting to know more about why might that be in an age of abundance where journalists have so much to share with people. The key motivations that people give is in part sort of too much about politics and COVID-19. A large share of people who say they feel that the news is untrustworthy or biased, a concern about being worn out by the amount of news that people feel they might have to engage with, but also more personal reasons, like more than 1/3 saying that they feel the news essentially is depressing. It has a negative impact on their mood. It leads to arguments that they'd rather avoid in their personal and private lives. And finally, that many feel that there's nothing they can do with the information, that they don't feel it's particularly compelling to engage with things that are depressing and perhaps untrustworthy, and that they don't feel really has any utility or any actionable importance in their own lives. The broader issue here beyond interest and avoidance, of course, is trust, amongst other things, the way in which people think about their relationship with the news. And in many markets across the world, we've really seen the increase in trust we saw last year around the pandemic really evaporate in many places. It's not quite the same in India. There's a lot of variation from market to market, where actually we've seen a very small but statistically significant increase in the percentage of people who say they feel they can trust most news most of the time. So 41% this year, which is sort of about the global average across the 46 markets that we look at. India is 20th out of the 46 markets in terms of how many people say they feel they can trust most news most of the time. But of course, concerns here go well beyond trust itself. And one issue that we looked at this year is whether people feel that news on balance is free from undue political or commercial influence. And here we have huge variation. And I've just sort of put in the numbers here for India to compare to some of the markets we cover in Europe. Whereas in India, about a third of our respondents feel that the media are free from undue political influence or undue business influence, with the clear majority of the public being somewhat more skeptical or even thinking the media is not free from undue political or business influence, which places India somewhere in the middle of the range of European countries that we cover. So not quite as dark a view of the media as we see in some of Southern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, but nowhere near as many people in India feeling the media is free from undue political or commercial influence as in parts of Northern and Western Europe. The reason it's important to think about interest and avoidance and trust and people's perception of the news, of course, is primarily about whether news is in fact able to play the role in society that it might like, that journalists might like it to play, and whether people in turn see journalism play this role as being independent, informative, and perhaps watchdogs. But there are also more narrowly sort of self-interest and strategic reasons for news organizations and journalists to care about trust and interest, because of course, this is amongst the factors that underpin whether people might be willing to pay for online news. If people find the news depressing, irrelevant, untrustworthy, subject to undue political or commercial influence, why would they pay for it? And this is an issue that we've tracked over some time. And what we see across the world now is really a sort of a saturation in many markets where growth has sort of petered off in terms of the percentage of people who say that they are paying in some form for online news. Across the last year, the top line average across the 20 markets where we have quality data on this is the same as last year. 70% say they paid in some form for online news last year. Not all of these, I should hasten to add, are subscriptions or ongoing payments, so that figure will be lower. There are some markets where we've seen some growth, but also many others where the numbers are stagnant or even in slight decline. That makes it, I think, important to think about what this new market will look like, where it seems like a minority might be willing to pay, but not everyone and not for everything. And what we find in our research is that the ongoing story we've documented for some time in our research of winner takes most dynamics are really persistent. So in almost every country where we have good data on this, not only is it a minority of people who say they pay for online news, it's also the case that it's only in a few countries that significant numbers of people pay for local titles. So much of the subscription revenue goes to a few national titles. In some countries, it's very, very few, Portugal or the UK, very few people who pay for online local news. It's also important to notice that it's very few markets, really only the US and Australia, where the median number of online news subscriptions people say they have is higher than one. So in most markets, this is a winner takes most dynamic where a limited number of people are convinced enough of the value of news to pay for it. And almost all of them have only one subscription, generally to an upmarket national title rather than a local title or a more niche title. And I think it's important to understand here that it's not because people aren't paying for anything online. I'm just going to use UK data to illustrate this point here, because when we look at different kinds of online subscriptions, we see that very large numbers of people are paying for, say, TV streaming or music or even audiobooks and podcasts or sports, whereas much smaller numbers of people say they have an ongoing subscription to online news. And the age profiles here, I think, are quite interesting, is that most of the forms of digital content subscriptions we track in our research either have sort of an even age profile, that's audiobooks or podcasts and sports, or actually skew younger, such as television streaming and music streaming, where it's only really news, where it's primarily older people who are convinced enough of the value of news to pay for it. So when we think about how people orient themselves in this digital environment, one question that I think is increasingly coming up is the question of whether people increasingly are navigating by individual personalities online, or whether brands are still central to this. Of course, personalities has long been central to television in particular, with very prominent and often very controversial hosts, very polarizing hosts playing an outsized role in some countries. But I think it's interesting here to have a sense of what our research says about the general way in which members of the public orient themselves when it comes to news. And actually here, I think from the point of view of news organizations, it's important to note that in most markets that we look at, it's a clear majority who say they primarily orient themselves towards news brands. India is part of this. So 2/3 of our respondents, 66%, say that they pay more attention to the news brand than they do to specific journalists or commentators. So of course, some of these individuals like to think they are important. Some of them actually are important and visible and influential. But actually, in most markets, including India, it's still the case that brands are the main way in which people orient themselves when it comes to news. So we should recognize, but not exaggerate, the importance of individuals and sort of specific commentators or media personalities in how people orient themselves. There are some more detailed data in a few markets. We haven't been able to do this in every market, but just as sort of a sense of what the most well-known journalists are in different markets, where, for example, in the UK, I think it's important to recognize here that the majority of the most well-known journalists are actually not these polarizing commentators who can generate a lot of noise and be quite visible in certain circles and often through controversy that they actively court. Actually, the most well-known UK journalists are generally journalists who operate for duly impartial, regulated broadcasters, quite centrist, quite limited in terms of their opinion, and generally outlets that have a broad and politically diverse audience, so the BBC, but also ITV and Channel 4. They're mostly men, they're mostly white, but as said, only a minority of them are from opinion-led environments, such as columnists who work for national newspapers, magazines. The reason I highlight this from the UK is that, of course, in some markets, the picture is very different. So in the United States, for example, again, most of the well-known journalists are men, most of them are white, but here actually a lot of them are from television and radio broadcasters, and a lot of them are from brands that really lead with opinion. Fox News, MSNBC on the left, several Fox News personalities on the list like this. So much more populated by opinion-led, sort of controversial television personalities than the picture we saw from the UK. In terms of how these journalists should behave on social media, we see in most, but not all countries, that a clear majority of our respondents believe that journalists, when they are on social media, such as Facebook and Twitter, should stick to reporting the news and sharing news stories. But it is also the case that there is a minority, about a third in several of these markets, who believe that journalists should also be able to express their personal opinions in addition to reporting the news and sharing the news on social media. So a somewhat sort of different view of this than what one is often sort of presented with in future of journalism type discussions. But part of the reason that people increasingly, I think, are thinking differently about this is that we see some interesting age breakdowns here, with younger people often being more open to the idea that journalists, when they use social media like Twitter and Facebook, should also be able to express their more personal opinions. There's not majority support for this, even amongst the 18 to 24-year-olds, but it is worth noting here that in the younger groups, 18 to 24 and 25 to 34, there is sort of slight plurality of respondents who actually embrace the idea that journalists can be more expressive about their personal opinions in addition to sharing and reporting news on social media. So when we think more broadly about this issue of the gateways through which people access news online, we have for some years been tracking the shift from sort of direct discovery, where people primarily go directly to a news site or app to get online news, to a world in which distributed forms of site-door access, such as social media and search, play a larger role. And this year is actually the first year where there is a clear, statistically significant difference, where social media is actually ahead of direct discovery. And of course, collectively, social media search and aggregators are by now far more widely named as the main way in which people get news online. And here I think it's really interesting to just to sort of keep front and center that in a market such as India, which is very mobile dominated and with a younger population, and where there is a greater orientation towards platforms, the figures here are even more pronounced. Just 12% of our respondents in India say that going directly to a news site or app is their main way of getting news online. 34% identify search, and 29% identify social. When we break this down more by different social networks, we can see that Facebook is in many markets still the most important when it comes to news, though there is an increase in importance of platforms such as YouTube and WhatsApp, and some growth in TikTok, in particular among younger users. But again, I think here we really need to pay attention to the specificities of different markets. So of course, in India, Facebook is very important, but actually even more important is WhatsApp. 51% of our respondents in India say that they share and discuss and get news while using WhatsApp. And interestingly, 53% actually identify YouTube, which is far more important in India than it is in many other countries we cover, at least amongst our respondents of English language internet users. So just to wrap up with a few key takeaways from our analysis, and then we'll open up for discussion, really get some much more in-depth and personal experiences and perspective on this from our panelists. Really, I think we have 5 key takeaways here that are particularly important for us. The first is, I think in many countries across the world, we see a real sort of risk of a growing number of people really disconnecting from the news and selectively or even altogether avoiding engaging with the news. And much of this has to do with the experience that people find that news is sort of quite depressing and not very relevant or actionable from their own point of view. And in particular, amongst younger people, there is a tendency that people say that the news leave them feeling down and that there isn't really anything they can do with this information, so why bother to engage with it? We also see in many countries across the world, and I think this point was very clear amongst our respondents in India, that people are really concerned about the news media being subject to undue political or commercial influence. It's only a relatively small minority who believe that the news media in India are free from undue political and commercial influence. And while there are still quite a lot of people who say they trust most news most of the time, in most of the countries we cover, there is a sort of an erosion of the trust increase we saw during the pandemic. So I think there are some real questions here for journalists and news media about how news media can earn trust, often in these sort of highly polarized environments, such as that we also see in India. When it comes to online news payments, it's clear there's still growth in some richer countries, but it's slowing down, it seems, in many of them. And I think the central sort of question here really is, at least for those news organizations who are seeking to build their editorial future in large part on reader revenues of various sources, is this question of what does it take to convince people that news is worth paying for in a world where people have so much information available for them online in particular. We also see this sort of continuing development where news websites and apps are really not the starting point for people's journeys to news, in particular amongst younger users who really clearly prefer to use social media or search as gateways to news, and often have slightly different norms about how they feel that journalists should behave in these distributed environments, and are, at least in our data, more comfortable with the idea that journalists, in addition to reporting the news, can also express personal opinions when they engage in social media. Finally, in terms of the sort of evolving range of platforms that people rely on, it's clear that Facebook is still really important for lots of news users across the world. But it's also clear that there are more and more visual platforms that are very important. Instagram, TikTok, and Telegram are growing overall, and in India in particular, it's very clear that WhatsApp is important for sharing news, not always particularly credible news necessarily, but very widely used amongst people to access and share news. And also, of course, YouTube, very, very widely used amongst our respondents. So these are some key takeaways from our point of view, from the global report, and also some highlights from India. And I really look forward to hearing the panelists' perspectives on our research and the situation in India when it comes to news and journalism. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
Thanks so much, Rasmus. That was really interesting. And I think I was most fascinated by this declining interest in news, because when we at Newslaundry travel, for our election reporting, this is something that we do hear anecdotally from a lot of young people. And often it's because it's too chaotic and it's too confusing, and watching the news or listening to the news or reading the news doesn't really help them understand what's really happening. So we'll get to that in more detail. But we have a really fascinating, diverse panel with us today. Pooja Pande, who's from Khabar Lahariya. She's co-CEO there. Khabar Lahariya is focused on rural reporting. It has a team of all women rural reporters. We have Meena Kotwal with us, who's founding editor of the Mooknayak. It's an online platform that's addressing a huge blind spot in the mainstream media, which is stories about the marginalized people from marginalized castes and tribes. We have Ritika Chopra with us, who's national education editor with the Indian Express. It's a mainstream English daily. And Ritu Kapur, who's co-founder and managing editor at the Quint, which is an online news platform. So I thank you so much for joining us on a Monday, heavy news day. I want to just get to all of you one by one. First, just on your initial thoughts on the survey, anything that struck you guys as problems that you've been coping with in the newsroom or issues that you've been thinking about. So just take it away. Anyone who'd like to just step in with their initial thoughts.
Hi. Diving straight into it, I think a couple of takeaways that completely resonate with me is visual consumption of news via social media platforms and not directly to site. For us, for instance, our biggest footprint is YouTube, more than any other platform. Wow. The other, which came through in the survey when I read it, is the need, because it's a younger audience, the need for news publishers, news creators to make content accessible and explain to the younger audience why that news is significant or important to them. Now, whether you do it overtly and say, this is news and this is why it's important for you, or you devise mimicking ways and formats which mimic how they're consuming content on Instagram, Reels or Shorts, on YouTube, or you just got to be where they are. And I think that's becoming, for us, for instance, it's really important from the view that we must drive everybody to the site and everybody must be consuming content on our site. Given the news environment, given the polarization, given all the misinformation, disinformation that's out there, we are now very clear that we want to be in as many platforms as where the audience is and as easy to consume formats, so that as much of the counter narrative to one narrative is there, we're out there at least putting a few questions out there and putting a few facts out there which may not otherwise be that obvious. I'm surprised that as high as 35 or 36% of the people surveyed in India feel that news is free from undue influence from politics and corporates. That I must say, I was expecting from the kind of cohort that I think the survey was done with. I was a little surprised with that.
Okay. Pooja, would you like to comment with anything that you want to quickly comment on, something that resonated with you in the survey?
Yeah, actually at the outset, not to be the killjoy, and I know that it says this in the survey, but Rasmus, as we know, the survey, the report itself doesn't really reflect India, right? So it reflects a certain niche. It's very true for Khabar Lahariya actually, because just what we've been doing for 20 years and our audience, I can safely say isn't really reflected in this report. And I can see it with a couple of the trends that have come up, and we can talk about it as we go along. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. I also had a question on the base number, because I'm not an expert in reading these reports. So when it says 2000, what does it mean? If you could tell me that. And then I'll just add a comment about what I do feel is resonant with, even after having, sounded off that killjoy kind of disclaimer. What I do feel is resonant is, of course, the growth in digital and social. I mean, that is definitely something that I can say for rural India, particularly that shareable quality of news, which was something that was highlighted. So yeah, I had that question for Rasmus.
Do you want to just take that quickly, Rasmus?
Yeah, thanks for raising that. And to be very clear, I don't think that's a killjoy comment at all. I think it's really, really important for researchers to be very clear about the limitations of the work that they do. And we are very conscious of the fact that the research doesn't represent the wider Indian public and the experience of people who, have other languages as their first language, or aren't internet users, or have only limited internet access through a shared mobile phone, for example. So I think it's incredibly important to keep that front and center of how we discuss these findings, and I'm very glad that you reinforced that message. In terms of the base here, so we have about 2,000 respondents in India who are reflect what's called a quota sample. So they reflect the age distribution and in education distribution of the English language internet using population in India based on census records. So as said, it's not the Indian population at large, but it should be broadly representative of English language internet users. And that's sort of the only part of the population one can generalize to from this data.
मीना, कोई भी ऐसी चीज इस सर्वे में जिसके बाद जो आपको बहुत स्ट्राइक करी, particularly because you're also running an online platform and with a lot of focus on videos?
जी, मुझे लगता है जो इन्होंने जो रिसर्च दिखाया है पूरा, वो बहुत ज्यादा अलग नहीं है। इंडिया में भी वही सारी चीजें होती है कि किस तरह का यूथ है, किस तरह की खबरें देखते हैं और कौन से जर्नलिस्ट को देखते हैं, वो सारी चीजें इसमें बताया गया है कि ब्रांड इंपॉर्टेंट होता है, जर्नलिस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट होता है। तो वो हम लोग भी जान रहे हैं कि आज की डेट में जो है, आज जर्नलिस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट हो गया है, कई सारे जर्नलिस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट हो गए। अगर वो ब्रांड चेंज कर देते हैं तो उनका व्यूअरशिप वहीं पर जाता है जो उनके जर्नलिस्ट हैं। और एक चीज जो मुझे क्लिक की यहाँ पे कि जो मुझे लगता है कि यहाँ पे अगर मैं कास्ट से जोड़ूं, इंडिया में हम लोग रह रहे हैं तो हम लोग कास्ट से उसको जोड़ेंगे क्योंकि वो वहाँ पे है तो वो रेसिज्म से जोड़ते हैं। तो 96% जो है यूके में वाइट पीपल को देखते हैं जो ऑडियंस है, और यूएस में 84%। और यहाँ पे वो उल्टा अगर मैं कहूँ तो जो सवर्णा है, क्योंकि मीडिया में सबसे ज्यादा वही है, तो यहाँ पर जो डेटा है आएगा वो इससे भी ज्यादा डेंजरस आएगा। क्योंकि हम लोगों ने देखा है जो ऑक्सफेम की रिपोर्ट आई है, जो न्यूज़लॉन्ड्री के साथ ही आई थी, उसमें किस तरह का डेटा है, क्योंकि वहां पे सारे के सारे जो है सवर्णा डोमिनेंट है और वहां पे जर्नलिस्ट जो डिसीजन मेकिंग में है ही नहीं, तो उनको देखने के लिए कोई है ही नहीं, एंकर्स नहीं है, दलित आदिवासी वहां पे है ही नहीं। तो मुझे लगता है वहां ये जो डेटा है यहाँ पे तो और ज्यादा वो डेंजरस होगा अगर हम लोग कास्ट वाइज करेंगे, जो 2006 में भी वही रिपोर्ट की थी। तो मुझे बहुत ज्यादा अलग नहीं लगा, वैसा ही सारी है। और ऑडियंस यहाँ का जो यूथ है, वहां का यूथ है लगभग वैसा ही है, जो मतलब न्यूज पे नहीं जाता है, वो सारी चीजें वो उनको कहाँ ग्लैमराइज लगता है, वो सारी चीजें वो देखना पसंद करता है।
It's very interesting, Rasmus. What she's saying is that when you look at the consumption in US and UK, it's all white. Mostly the anchors are all white. And in India, if you were to do a similar survey, you'd find that all anchors are upper caste. You would rarely, and we've done this report with Oxfam, that you just simply don't have anyone from the marginalized caste on your television screen. And most newsrooms, what she said is it will be even more dangerous to look at newsrooms because most editorial positions would be upper caste men and women. Ritika, do you want to quickly come in with anything that you want to point out, and then I have a question for you.
I mean, I'm just a little concerned with one finding. I mean, it isn't exactly a revelation. We know that youngsters, sort of young news consumers, are not using traditional news outlets to consume news, and they're going to social media platforms. My concern with that finding is something that we've known for a while is these platforms are sort of firmly focused on personalities, celebrities, influencers, and it leaves us, as in us journalists, sort of to play second fiddle when it comes to delivering news. This is essentially a medium, where you get your facts, but your facts are kind of skewed with perspective. I've increasingly noticed that, commentary sort of is being confused for fearless journalism. Fearless journalism, is a term which is thrown around a lot, especially on these platforms. But I feel that sometimes opinion kind of is valued more than facts. Perspective sort of is being prioritized over objective reporting. So it's more sort of a concern. I really hope that my concerns and fears are sort of misplaced. I'm just worried that at this point, the youth, I think the report said the age cohort of 18 to 25 sort of is largely consuming its news on social media. But this cohort sort of, I think at some point will end up being the majority of our news consumers. And given the platform on which they're consuming news, I mean, my fear is that may just end up changing the rules of journalism, and maybe not for the better. Because as a journalist, my job is not to tell you that the government's corrupt. My job as a journalist is to prove that to you. I'll have to gather evidence for that, and that's really difficult. And mind you, actually, these findings, I mean, of course, the report tells us about news consumers, but we also have a generation of journalists, young journalists who are growing up in the age of social media, where they're seeing some of their colleagues being applauded more for their opinions versus their work. So, kind of reporters becoming performance artists. So I'm just a little concerned about what impact would this channel of news consumption which eventually have on the sector per se.
Interestingly, though, when you look at the expectation of journalists, apart from Brazil and Japan, I think most wanted journalists to stick to news. I mean, they want them to be able to even give their opinions, but I think the primary expectations still seem to be that give us the news. But of course, the definition of news changes.
But there is, again, like the report says, a very significant minority which is saying that you should be free to express your opinions. I'm presuming a lot of that is coming from the young readers. But again, like I said, that, they will eventually make up a majority of our news consumers. So I'd be very happy if my concerns are misplaced.
I must say that, sorry to cut you in, there's a survey done by Cisco with a similar cohort, only a slightly wider base, 10,000, but largely English-speaking, metro-based young people, 18 to 34. And most of them said that on different platforms, especially Instagram, they go to influencers over journalists. On platforms like Twitter, they think of journalists interchangeable with politicians. And where on Facebook, they actually preferred influencers over journalists. So to Ritika's point, this is something that was a bit worrying.
So I think, to me, like I said earlier, one of the most striking things that we really need to think about now is this disconnect with news or disinterest in news. And like I said, anecdotally, at least I've seen a lot of young people say that they are no longer. So of course, news being depressing is a common thing that people said, you want to switch off. We don't want to keep hearing about, upsetting things. But I think what is more dangerous is when people don't want to consume the news because it's not adding anything to their information ecosystem, and they feel that they end up being more confused. And this is something, again, you hear a lot in India, that the more we watch, the more we read on an issue, we come out confused. We're not really sure of what really happened. We're not sure about how to think about it. And we're not being equipped with tools to really understand what's happening around us because of news. And therefore, like Ritika said, that may also be one of the reasons why then you choose a trusted personality. You just want to listen to that person telling you, what is this all about? So I think, but the problem here is that when people say that it's depressing or it's leading to arguments or it's, it's not really adding to anything, it's a huge issue for newsrooms. Because we can't be entertaining or we can't be happy. Like there's this thing that a plane landing is not going to be front page news. It is going to be a plane crash. So what do you do when you are in the business of truth telling? And that is often not going to be pleasant or happy. How are we going to deal with this emotion that people feel that it's too depressing and we'd rather not watch news and watch something else? Anyone wants to take that? And especially, I think for all of you, because all of you, of course, there's the mainstream news and digital websites that are, covering a breadth of news. But for Khabar, Lahariya and Mooknayak also, you are really looking at stories that are being ignored by the mainstream media, which can often be hard-hitting, depressing, quote unquote. I would like to take that. Yeah. And then we can just go around. Yeah. I actually agree with you on the fact that, we're not meant to entertain. And of course, we shouldn't, let's not lose sight of the fact of the times that we're living in. Aside from the pandemic, it's been 2 years since that started. There is inflation. The markets are entering into a bear phase. There's a war. In India, actually, you have inter-community sort of tensions, political tensions. So I think journalism, by definition, at this point, it can't be good news. It's actually, I think, a reflection of the times that we're living in.
As far as dealing with this whole emotion that news is too negative, I have to be honest, at least in the Express newsroom, that's not really a conversation that we're having, because I don't really know as journalists whether you can really make news palatable. You have to be very honest with what you're doing. But what I guess we can do, and we are actually in fact doing that, is that we've started kind of, aside from just kind of delivering news, we're trying to make sense for it for the audience. We're trying to tell them that what does this development mean for you at a personal level. And I think that has worked really well for the Indian Express as a newspaper. During the pandemic, we noticed that there was this growing appetite for explanatory journalism, and say our Explain section, which say had 70,000 views, before the pandemic struck, now on an average gets about 2 lakh views a day, which is very impressive. Actually, the Explain section has turned out to be like this beacon of hope for the newspaper.
And explanatory journalism is
right. So that what we're basically trying to do is that, we're not just telling you that inflation is rising. We tell you what it means for your pocket. We're not just telling you that cases are going up. We'll try and make sense of it and tell you whether you should be worried and if there's a fourth wave around the corner. That's something I think that's one way, I guess, to deal with this perception that news is too negative, as opposed to just telling people what's happening. We can try and put that in context, like give them context about why this is happening and what this could mean for you.
Meena, do you want to comment? क्योंकि Mooknayak का जो focus है वो marginalized caste हैं और marginalized communities है, और एक perception ये भी रहता है और complaint भी रहती है कि जब भी हम उस section के बाद में बात करते हैं तो हम या तो crime story की बात कर रहे हैं या oppression की बात कर रहे हैं, हम तो एक ये complaint भी रहता है. ये सब चीजों के बारे में आप सोचते हैं और आप कैसे address करते हैं इस सेंटिमेंट को कि बहुत ही डिप्रेसिंग है, तो सब कुछ गलत हो रहा है?
बिल्कुल. पहले तो मूकनायक है मनीषा, सॉरी करेक्ट करना चाहिए. हाँ, जैसे रितिका ने भी कहा कि हम लोग एंटरटेनमेंट करने के लिए नहीं है, हम लोग यहाँ जर्नलिस्ट हैं, हम लोग सीरियस कंटेंट लाने के लिए हैं. और अगर आप देखें कि ये जो परसेप्शन बना हुआ है कि लोग सीरियस कंटेंट नहीं देखते हैं, तो ये तो डिसाइड करना पड़ेगा ऑडियंस को कि उसको व्हाट्सएप यूनिवर्सिटी की तरफ जाना है या जो फैक्ट है उस तरफ जाना है. तो ये तो उसको डिसाइड करना पड़ेगा. हमारे बहुत ज्यादा सब्सक्राइबर नहीं है यूट्यूब पर, और अभी 50,000 भी नहीं हुए हैं. लेकिन मुझे याद है जब पिछले साल वो नांगल वाला जो इंसिडेंट हुआ था, उसको जब मैंने कवर किया तो उस समय तो बहुत ज्यादा नहीं थे, इवन क्या कहते हैं 15-20 हजार ही थे सब्सक्राइबर, और उस समय हमारे 4-5 लाख जो है व्यूज आ रहे थे हमारे वीडियोस पे, और वो एकदम सीरियस कंटेंट था, ऐसा नहीं था कुछ उसमें एंटरटेनमेंट था. तो लोग जब देखना पसंद करते हैं इस तरह के लोग, तो वो सीरियस कंटेंट देखना भी पसंद करते हैं. वो डिपेंड करता है कि किस तरह के लोग हैं, तो वो उनको चुनना पड़ेगा कि हम लोग किस तरह के. मैं मतलब नहीं पसंद कर रही हूँ, जो सोसाइटी में हो रहा है हम लोग वो दिखाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, हम लोग रियल इशू लाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं. अभी जैसे आप लोगों से बात करते हुए भी अभी मेरे पास एक न्यूज आई है, उसमें जो दलित कम्युनिटी का जो दुल्हा था वो बारात लेकर गया एक जगह, और वहां पे उसके ऊपर पत्थर फेंके गए और वो वापस ही बिना शादी के वापस लौट गया. वो घायल है, उसकी अभी कंप्लेन भी नहीं लिखी गई, अभी बस मैंने पूरी खबर वो पढ़ी भी नहीं है. तो इस तरह की खबरें आती है, ये हम लोग नहीं क्रिएट कर रहे हैं, ये सोसाइटी में ऑलरेडी हो रहा है, जिसको हम लोग दिखाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं. ये मैं नहीं बना रही हूँ या आप बैठ के नहीं बना रहे, हम लोग ये वहां सोसाइटी में हो रहा है, हम लोग दिखाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं. तो या तो आप जब सोसाइटी में रह रहे हैं तो उस चीज को मान लीजिए, या फिर आप आंख बंद करके तो आप सोचिए कि बहुत अच्छी दुनिया है और वो सिर्फ आप इमेजिन करते हैं, तो ये पॉसिबल नहीं हो सकता. तो हम लोग वो कोशिश करते हैं जो सोसाइटी में हो रहा है हम लोग दिखाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं. तो फिर अगर आपको ये नहीं देखना तो फिर व्हाट्सएप यूनिवर्सिटी जो फेमस है अभी इस समय, जो फैक्ट्स पे काम नहीं करते, जो एक झूठ फैलाया जाता है, जो प्रोपेगेंडा फैलाया जाता है, तो फिर उसकी तरफ जाने में क्या बुराई, उस तरफ जाइए. लेकिन ये भी एक सच है कि यूथ को हमें इस तरफ लाना होगा, जैसे कि अभी बताया भी कि बहुत सारे लोग जो है सोशल मीडिया पे टिकटॉक देखते हैं, व्हाट्सएप देखते हैं, इंस्टाग्राम देखते हैं. तो ये सारे, इसमें भी हमें थोड़ा सा इस तरह से करना होगा कि जो ये सीरियस इशू हैं उनको 1 मिनट में उनके अकॉर्डिंग इजी लैंग्वेज में उस इशू को समझाना होगा, ताकि वो लोग वहां देखें. और सोशल मीडिया का आप जानते भी हैं एल्गोरिथम कि वो छोटी छोटी वीडियोज को भी प्रमोट ज्यादा करता है. जी आप कुछ कह रही थी.
Innovation and format to help
Exactly. हाँ.
your audience. Pooja, would you like to, is there even a concern for a rural audience that you are primarily catering to?
I think it's so interesting because I think the definition, जो परिभाषा है news or newsmaker की, I would even add the newsmaker in this. I think for Khabar Lahariya, that is what is different. And this is where I kind of have a slightly different opinion or a view of where we're coming from, which is that what is news? It's that plane crashing or it's COVID or it's, a fire or elections or famine, we know that. But that's what Khabar Lahariya is trying to change, right? That what news is something that's happening in my block, in my tehsil, right? If the hand pump is not working, something as basic as that is news for me, right? And something else is, the plane crashing is like Manhattan, right? Like it doesn't even exist. It's another country. So I think that, the power of solution and impact, which is something that we've just kind of organically done and now do consciously, which is that if Khabar Lahariya is going to write about this hand pump and the caste politics around this hand pump, कि दलित लोग नहीं जा सकते हैं, सिर्फ ब्राह्मण जाति का hand pump है, whatever. If we write about it and if we do a video about it, if we put it on social media, now we'll include all these things, then things happen. There's accountability happening. So for this person, news is not negative. Actually, you want more of it. So there'll be more of this. Actually, we'll get follow-up, requests. Ki yahan bhi aayi, stuff like that. So I just want to say that. And the newsmaker I wanted to add, because again, the newsmaker is not that upper caste male that will come, or if he comes. They're mostly doing WhatsApp University. They're mostly like phoning it in. But if he comes, he's just going to do that news peg and leave, right? Which is very different from what that woman who is from that community, who's marginalized, Dalit, tribal, Muslim, jo bhi community se wo hai, she has a stake. So what she is going to do is going to be very different. So I just wanted to I would have a different response to this. That I think एक तो ये कि ये news negative वाला as such मैं नहीं कहूँगी कि हमको ऐसा लग रहा है. During COVID, I do think एक fatigue आया था जो in and out of the newsroom था. मतलब हमारे साथ भी and outside the newsroom भी, जिसको हमने address किया. और एक लास्ट चीज मैं इसमें ये जोड़ना चाहूंगी कि शुरुआत से, because Khabar Lahariya, it's actually the oldest organization on this panel, right? So because we started with print, right? So there has always been a well-rounded approach to content, because हमारे वो digital social अभी जो pressures जो रितिका भी बोल रही हैं, सब बोल रहे हैं, उन pressures से हमने नहीं शुरू किया, right? कि audience define कर रही है content in that sense. So I think वो एक बड़ा interesting journey इसलिए रहा है. So it was, for instance, we used to call it Zile ki halchal, which is the vibe of the district. So that will not just be news, right? That will be a wedding that's happening. That will be the song. That will be a lot of culture, a lot of humor. So there's a lot of lightness anyway, I feel. मतलब जो आपने भी कहा मनीषा कि कुछ बहुत खराब ही होता है, oppressed ही होता है, ऐसा नहीं है, right? There is a lot of lightness, there is a lot of humor, and we see it, to survive in an arid landscape like Bundelkhand, where the ground table water is so low. It's the hottest. It went 50 degrees in this heat wave, and you have to walk. The women have to walk for miles to get water. They have a funny song around it, for instance, just to give an example, which says, Bavra tera pani, khasam mar jaye, meri gagri na toote. Which is that, my water thing shouldn't break. My husband can die because water is more important where I'm from. So it's just like a cheeky, funny way. I'm just bringing up this example because I really think that people ko a revelation lagta hai, but actually this is there. The only fatigue, Manisha, I want to add that people are seeing, and this is the young audience of Khabar Lahariya, is with TV news. We are seeing that fatigue happening, that people are shifting to digital and social.
And I think that is one way explains the number of young people who are going to YouTube, because there's a deep hunger for video content, which television news in India is just not able to fulfill. And I think that's why YouTube then becomes an interesting source to where people are leaving TV news that they want to go to YouTube and see what they can. Ritu, YouTube and mobile mostly our digital news consumers are consuming news on mobile. YouTube and WhatsApp are two main sources. Does that worry you, or is it exciting news for a digital only platform, which is Quint, because that's our medium?
I think it's both exciting and worrying. Exciting because that's what at least we're actually finding that we're getting a deeper engagement with our audiences. The audience is growing a little. It's not growing exponentially. Say the audience for a platform like the Quint. It's growing a little, but the engagement is going deeper. So I think those who are coming for ground reports, which is what we do mostly, we don't do so much of opinion. We do largely ground reports and, sort of try and get facts and try and get, not so heard voices out there. The engagement is growing. The quality of commenting is going, is far more engaged and informed. So I'm seeing some good things there. What's worrying is that it's happening much more in video. Video is very resource intensive. So one of the things that we're trying to figure and trying to, again, mimic is how influencers do it. Influencers who don't have deep budgets and don't have newsrooms and don't have multicam, blah. They're sort of putting their mobile phones and, recording things and putting together a bit raw, a bit clumsy, but fast, etc. So try and mimic that. And I think some of that is working for us. And I think you still have to be a little clever about formats. For instance, we're trying something. We started calling it Har Viral Video Kuch Kehta Hai. So you pick up a Kacha Badam video or that video of the teacher sleeping in the classroom with the student fanning her and use that as a hook and then go into what the deeper malaise or the deeper social truth that video is reflective of, and then try and engage the audiences there. So I'm not finding this news avoidance as bleak. The challenge is, how do you manage to invest in formats where the audience is not running away? Also, I think if you can do it in shorts, just say, मीना जी ने कहा अगर आप short format में कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि short format में अभी सारे algos, क्योंकि सब TikTok के success को mimic करना चाहते हैं, तो सबके algos short formats, YouTube Shorts, Facebook Reels, Instagram Reels, etc. वो उसको promote कर रहे हैं. So if that is where the algos are pushing it, that's where the audience is coming, then try and maximize that audience. The one unfortunate thing that I recently encountered, and I'm seeing a little tiny bit of a reflection of that in my newsroom, is I'd gone to Symbiosis for a session with students of journalism. And I was told that between 60 to 70% of the students passing out of the journalism courses are moving towards PR and other corporate communication, or they are not wanting to come towards journalism because, and so I got into a conversation with them. There is a sense of hopelessness. I think there is a sense of activism that has come into journalism where they feel कि अगर हम वो story कर भी लेंगे तो क्या हासिल होगा? There is a sense of hopelessness or pointlessness that I felt among them towards journalism as a career, which was upsetting. I must confess that we've had a very tiny percentage, but we've had 2 or 3 people, very, very bright journalists in our newsroom move out because again, this sense of, but I'm not being able to change anything. And, but, there are only so many newsrooms that there are where I can do the kind of journalism that I want to do. And again, it's affecting my mental health because when I'm on the ground and I'm hearing stories and I'm reporting on them, I come back and I can't sleep. I can't. So that I'm a little more worried about that right now than the general sense of news avoidance, because I feel that in a lot of Indians are actually, for good or for bad, are engaging a lot more with news. I agree. It's not so much television. It's the avoidance from television. I find that at least video, digital, mobile, and you better have your content on WhatsApp. If WhatsApp University is what you have to combat, you better have your, this is no time to vacate these platforms.
Rasmus, great, thanks. Rasmus, do you think this is fundamentally flawed to create this entertainment and news binary, like what we were talking about earlier, that journalists are not supposed to make you happy, or journalists are not supposed to be giving you the good news. We're here to do the hard news telling. Are journalists looking at it in a slightly flawed way? And Ritu's point on, journalists not wanting to be journalists. A lot of young people, if they're not consuming news, they're also not going to want to be journalists. So you're looking at a pretty bleak future with no consumers and no producers of news.
Look, I mean, I think it's really important to be very clear that there are very real challenges, and it's not surprising if there are people who are looking at it and thinking, maybe this is not for me. I mean, India has slid another 8 places in the World Press Freedom Index last year. We see some really troubling attacks on individual reporters, often from Muslim backgrounds or people who do reporting in rural areas, whether that's from authorities or from organized crime of various sorts. And it's also, I think, important to be clear that while the industry has sort of benefited from a sort of a surge in revenue coming out of the pandemic, that I think it's fair to say that a lot of legacy news organizations in India still have quite a lot of work ahead of them in terms of developing models that are long-term sustainable for digital environments. And as Ritu knows well from personal experience, it's not easy for new entrants either. It's a challenging environment, and I think we need to be clear about that. And in terms of sort of what people want, I mean, again, I think there is an element of sort of sober realism that's probably necessary in discussions like this. We live in an age of anger. There are a lot of angry men out there, and they are mostly men. And that means there also is a market for angry male sort of forms of expression. That's the world we live in. And I think we have to sort of recognize that journalism serves the public it has and not the public it might sort of want. That said, I also want to stress that while I think the challenges are very real and are particularly real in the context of India, we haven't even talked really about proprietors either. That's a whole other side of this. I myself am sort of a cautious, evidence-based optimist, I would say, about where we're heading with the profession and with the industry. And what I mean by that is that I think there is a beginning, and I see it very clearly on display on this really impressive panel, of a sort of an acceptance of where we are. That journalism and news media were in a situation in the past where the problem they solved was that they gave a few options to people who had none when it came to information. And increasingly, of course, with the partial exception of people who serve very underprivileged communities, is that journalists are just one of many, many options people have. And that's raised a new set of questions, right? Where I think there's not one set of answers that's right for every news organization or every journalist. But crudely put, our research would suggest that a lot of the public have fairly traditional expectations of what they would actually like from journalism. They would like journalism to be relatively independent of powerful entities in society. They would like it to be informative. And they wouldn't mind if it also sort of kicked powerful people on the shin from time to time if they were up to no good. And for that part of the public, I really think that journalists who sort of would broadly subscribe to those ideals of journalism, the central challenge really is to prove to people that this is what we're providing, right? And that if people don't feel they can tell the difference between the news that news organizations provide and other stuff on the internet, and don't feel news is independent, don't feel it's informative, and don't feel that it's holding power to account, at the very least, we have a marketing problem. And perhaps sometimes the truth is that we have a product problem. I mean, is journalism always independent? Is it always informative? Is it always holding power to account? That's not a view I would subscribe to. So I think part of it is to recognize, and that's actually quite a strong demand for fairly traditional forms of journalism. And if we feel we're offering it, then it's about communicating the value of what we're doing. And if sometimes perhaps parts of the profession, the industry falls short of that, then it's a question of how we can rise to that challenge. The other side of the coin, and this is something that Meena raised, I think is really important, is that in every society that I'm familiar with, journalism historically has aimed and claimed to serve the whole public, but on closer inspection, that's always been a lie. It's predominantly been male dominated, both in terms of the people who did it, in terms of the people that they covered, and in terms of the people that they reached. It's been deeply unequal in terms of class, in terms of ethnicity, race, caste. This lie has been revealed for what it is in a world where people have more choice, where it becomes more visible that there are many communities very poorly served by existing forms of journalism. So that, I think, gives us a different kind of answer to the question of what is the value of journalism, not just sort of trying to demonstrate one's commitment to traditional values of journalism. A different response is to define who you are for, like who is it that you do journalism for? And I'm really encouraged to see that we don't only see, angry male forms of journalism or the sort of righteous performance of moral clarity as responses to that question. We also see, I think, and obviously there are some very important examples of that on this panel, but you have colleagues around the world who try to do the same thing, who say, you know what, there are lots of people who serve the most privileged people in my country. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to do journalism for this group. Or I'm going to do journalism for this community. Or I'm going to do journalism for women in this area. And I think there's something very valuable in that, in being very clear about who it is that one does journalism for. So I'm cautiously optimistic that there are ways ahead of this. This doesn't make the political challenges go away. It doesn't make the business easier. It doesn't make it less stressful to be a reporter when there are sort of angry people baying at you all the time, and some of them are quite powerful and can come after you. But I do think that if we sort of listen to what the public actually says it wants, some of it is sort of pretty traditionally valuable forms of journalism, and some of it is that people want to be treated equally by a profession in an industry that actually has a pretty poor record of serving the whole public. And I think it's so encouraging to see more and more new initiatives, and some of them quite old, that's been around for a while, really take that seriously, the question of inclusion and serving the whole public.
Manisha, can I ask Rasmus one question quickly? Yeah. Rasmus, just one thing. To me personally, when I look at the finding about selective news avoidance, I think that's what you've called it in the report. I mean, that doesn't really worry me, because to my mind, I thought that it was impossible to sustain the gains made during the pandemic, right? There were lockdowns, there were restrictions on movement. So I understand that the levels of news avoidance are much higher than 2015. But that increase, I mean, don't you think that was inevitable? I mean, once people got out and, went about their normal lives, they wouldn't be consuming, they will start disengaging, right? They will not consume news the way they were during lockdowns or when there were restrictions on movement. That's something I just thought that if you would relate the increase in disengagement to the lifting of restrictions. I mean, I don't know if those gains were sustainable.
Sure. No, I see what you mean. And I think it's very clear, of course, no one expected the sort of boom in traffic from the hardest bits of the pandemic to be sustainable. But, I think the most important part of the story, I think, are the big increases since 2015 in avoidance, and also the growing minority of people who aren't really engaging with very much news at all. Now, I think there are sort of two different sort of ways to interpret that, and I would probably encourage people to sort of hold both of them in their head at the same time. One of them is that, let's be clear, it's perfectly sensible to avoid the news sometimes. The world is a confusing place, and sometimes reading about terrible things happening quite far from your local area, it might be informative, but it may not be that actionable, and sometimes it's understandable if people want to focus on things that are more proximate to themselves, as long as they don't tune out of the news entirely. I don't see a real problem with that. What I would worry about, and I do worry about, as someone who sort of studies journalism from a place of love, I would say, and someone who cares about the profession and the industry, and despite its imperfections, is that if a growing minority, if their sort of avoidance sort of hardens to the point where they have no ongoing engagement with news, that I find quite troubling from a public interest point of view, and in terms of sort of maintaining a society that is not just informed, but relatively equally informed, and where a few people are left behind in an informational sense. In terms of the significance of selective avoidance from a more pragmatic point of view for editors and media executives, I think we sort of need to keep in mind here that a lot of our sort of established models of journalism, both editorially but also commercially, are based on a premise of habit, right? We print roughly the same number of print newspapers every day because we expect to sell roughly the same number of them. We expect roughly the same viewership for the television news programs, and we sell advertising against those roughly stable numbers. I think we are moving towards a world in which only the most successful and biggest established news organizations can expect a relatively stable audience, and where a lot of other news organizations are going to see very extreme fluctuations or quite sort of significant fluctuations in their audience. And I think that has both editorial and commercial implications. Editorially, and how do you make the most of it when you have people's attention? How can you lead them on to something else that's significant and interesting? And commercial, of course, because it means that the revenue flows won't be as stable as one might like. And the opportunities to convert people to members or subscribers are not going to be as stable as one might like. So I think it requires a little bit of an adaptation of both the editorial and the commercial mindset. Even as I think we should recognize that many people have perfectly reasonable causes for not engaging with all the news all the time. And that the most worrying thing is probably that some people seem to be tuning out altogether because they just don't feel that we're doing anything that's worthwhile from their point of view.
I think I want to come to the bit on 36% of Indians surveyed think that we're independent from undue political or government influence, and 35% think that they're independent of undue business or commercial influence. So, Meena, ये आंकड़ों के बारे में आपको क्या लगता है? आपकी audience जो है, जो feedback आपको आता है, would you say that it's the same, that they think mainstream media largely is free of like undue pressures from governments and corporations?
मतलब हम लोगों का जो काम है वो तो बिल्कुल गवर्नमेंट के अगेंस्ट ही जाता है, क्योंकि जिस तरह का हम लोगों का काम रहता है और कमर्शियल हमारे बीच में इन्वॉल्व है नहीं, कहीं से कुछ है नहीं, और मुझे लगता है इस तरह से होना भी नहीं चाहिए। पॉलिटिकल हो या कोई कमर्शियल हो, कोई दबाव नहीं होना चाहिए। इससे क्या होगा कि अगर जिसका भी हम लोग जिसके भी प्रेशर में फिर पॉलिटिकल के फेवर में काम करेंगे तो उनका एक प्रेशर रहेगा कि अच्छा हमारी ये न्यूज नहीं जानी चाहिए या हमारा ये काम नहीं दिखाना होगा, या इसी तरह का कमर्शियल होगा। जो बड़े बड़े बिजनेसमैन हैं, अगर हम उनको सपोर्ट करेंगे या वो हमें कुछ सपोर्ट करेंगे तो फिर हम लोग उनको, फिर वो अनबायस्ड रहेगा वो पूरी तरह से। तो वो मुझे लगता है वो होना भी नहीं चाहिए। और मेरा जो ऑडियंस है, जो मूकनायक का ऑडियंस है, वो भी यही चाहता है, क्योंकि जो हम लोगों का जो काम है वो पूरा हाशिए पे खड़े समाज के लिए, और जिनको तो सदियों से दरकिनार किया गया, इग्नोर किया गया, जिनके लिए तो मेन स्ट्रीम मीडिया में वो खबरें ही नहीं होती जिस तरह की हम लोग न्यूज करते हैं, जिस तरह की हम लोग खबरें लाते हैं, तो वो तो उनके लिए है ही नहीं। तो उनको पता है कि यहाँ पे ना पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज का सपोर्ट रहेगा, ना यहाँ पे कोई आपका बिजनेसमैन आएगा। तो वो सारी चीजें होती हैं, हम लोग बिल्कुल उसको अलग भी रखते हैं। और मुझे लगता है ये सभी को, जो जितने भी जर्नलिज्म में इससे जुड़े हुए हैं, उनको सबको ये सारी चीजें अलग ही रखनी चाहिए और बिल्कुल फ्री होना चाहिए, क्योंकि जर्नलिस्ट जो होता है वो सब तरह की न्यूज दिखाना चाहिए उसको।
Pooja, I think my question is to you would be that because you have a good understanding also of your news consumers and you work so closely with your reporters are from that community, like you said, the impression that they may have of mainstream media, for example, do you think they'd agree that they're largely free, or do you think there's a lot of complaint that you hear of mainstream media either too influenced by business or corporations or politicians?
So I think two things. One is the Lahariya reporter, who is a different species from the Lahariya audience, right? And the Lahariya audience today with digital, of course, is the younger generation and obviously male, unfortunately. But the older generation, because we've been around for 20 years, who've been following us from the print days, for them, I would say that legacy media actually, and print, which has not gone anywhere where we are, is being consumed with like no pinches of salt at all. So that audience, no. The younger generation who are following digital and social do often, we do see that they do raise the point, or, they do question WhatsApp University and all of that. The Lahariya reporter is a different species, right? Because there's a different kind of training and, awareness that the reporter has gone through. So it's interesting because for Lahariya itself, that the trust factor is actually our biggest thing, right? Because we've earned it the hard way, where we've started with print. So we've actually distributed newspapers on the ground. You know who your reporters are, you're from the community. So I don't think that we've faced a deficit. If anything, it's been, it's increased, I feel, especially over the pandemic with Khabar Lahariya per se. But the gloom and doom news would be that the majority of the audience are reading there. In our case, it's not Times of India, which was interesting, even in this poll, that Times of India is the largest, I think, even in terms of people thinking that it's unbiased. And the owner said that he's in the business of advertising and not news, right? But that doesn't trickle down when you're consuming that news. So it's the same for us. For us, it's the Amar Ujalas and the Dainik Jagrans and the Dainik Bhaskars. It's not Times of India, but Does that answer the question?
Sheer breadth of reporting that these newspapers are able to do. So I think maybe there's a certain trust factor in the sense that they will cover everything that's happening in my city. Like if you're in Delhi and you pick up the Times of India, the Delhi city pages will tell you everything you need to know. And so maybe it's a trusted source of information in the sense that you can surely trust them to cover something that's important that's happening around in your area. Maybe like that's one of the
I think the question of trust doesn't come up, Manisha. It's like it's a non-issue. I feel like that conversation, which for us is so pressing, and it seems like, in the cities it's like this burning thing. It doesn't really matter. That's not how people are consuming news.
Ritu, you had said that you were very surprised by this number.
Having said that, I think, I was just before the pandemic hit, I think just about then, Reporters Without Borders had done a media ownership monitor in India. And interestingly, they found that there were very few media organizations whose true ownership information was available. So I think maybe this statistic speaks to the complete opacity and complete lack of regulatory formats or whatever that require transparent disclosure of who, very few people, even in the cohort that's been surveyed, would really know that most legacy media or most media in this country is owned by a handful of conglomerates. I don't think it's something that is talked about. I don't think it is necessary for media houses to disclose it, nor cross ownership, nor other media businesses that could or could not impact, your editorial, etc. So I think I don't think there's enough of a discourse on that, and therefore this feeling that it's. But I think one of the things that we talk about a little bit is how now it's very, very important for us to not let our bias. It's very difficult to not have strong views in today's polarized India, but to not let the bias come in the way of fact-based journalism, to not lose track of that, to not let our anger, frustration, and all these other emotions come in the way of your journalism. Because I think that is where, that's where some of the trust goes away, because if they find that you're very constantly only talking about, one part of the news and not talking about the other aspects, and that's the only lesson for us. But I think this opacity of information on ownership of media is what the statistic is talking to.
That's a very interesting point you raised, because you're right. I think most people surveyed would probably not know who owns their media. So then that question of trust, or what the there's no conversation around conflict of interest. And that's largely because, like you said, there's really no clarity on who owns which media house. Ritika, when you talk about trust, I think mainstream media often becomes the punching bag, sometimes rightly so, and sometimes unfairly, because they do a very important job of news gathering in a way that many digital outlets may not be able to do. But of course, then there are questions of political influence, stories being dropped, stories being killed, influence. A model that's heavily dependent on advertisements. There's going to be lots of questions on why you didn't touch the story, that story. So how do you view this, especially in a polarized environment where you're all sides are questioning you in terms of you not being trustworthy?
I think as far as ownership is concerned, the point that you Ritu raised, if I can speak for the Indian Express, at least for us, it's really helpful that we're a single business entity. We don't really have any other business interests. We don't really have any other interlocking interests. And that too, I think that's where half the battle is won, because that really insulates us from government pressure on various fronts, And of course, Indian Express, it's part of legacy media, but it also has very strong legacy of having a very fiercely independent newsroom, and has had the legacy of not buckling under pressure. But what we try and do now, as far as your question of being questioned from various quarters is concerned about not being trustworthy, I think what we do is we just stick to the basics. We stick to objective, fact-based news reporting. We invest in shoe leather reporting. We do stories, which frankly, I think if you look at our work for the last, maybe even if you pick up the work over the last 6 months, there will be stories which haven't been liked by people on either side of the spectrum, whether it's the left or the right. I mean, whether it's, reporting on the Khargon violence, how the government ended up raising one of the houses that it helped build, or, shutting down, a bureaucrat shutting down the stadium, a sports stadium, because he wants to walk his dog in the evening, or maybe even reporting on the crisis within the Congress, which is not really in power. But at some point in time, people would have had, certain quarters or certain ends of the spectrum, or people with certain ideologies may have had a problem with it. But we're trying to stick to fact-based reporting, not really taking sides, just trying to inform opinions with facts, not telling people what you should think, just presenting them with the facts and letting them make up their minds. In a very hyper-partisan world, that obviously, I think this approach may not help us win a lot of loyal friends on either side, But I strongly believe, and I think that's also the belief within the Express newsroom, that there is a space for that as well. There will be people who will come to us to just find out what's happening in the country and what's going wrong. And I kind of agree with Ritu to some extent, where you can't let your anger or your anguish really get in the way of reporting. And that I think in a very hyper-partisan world, it's a bit of a struggle. But at Express, day in and day out, that is one message that the editors and it's constantly being driven home, that, leave commentary aside, you're journalists, get us facts, let us inform opinions. And we try and, like I said, try and do that very objectively, which may not exactly be a very popular approach. Or I don't know, doesn't help us win any popularity contests. Yeah.
Great. And just one quick question, Rasmus, like when it comes to subscriptions, is there anything in the survey that tells us that, so you said that, most people now are rethinking subscribing to many news outlets, but is there, when it comes to trust, or when it comes to the sort of news that you're getting from these sources, is most of the subscriptions where you've studied the markets, is it mostly still being attracted by legacy media houses that are catering to information needs, or is it ideological? Is there any sort of understanding that we can get on that?
Thanks. I mean, I think that's a really useful way to sort of think about the difference between what the most vocal parts of the public, who often sort of flout the zone on Twitter and a few other platforms, say they want from journalism and say they think about journalism, and what the wider public, many of whom are not spending their time discussing politics or news on social media, but have other things they care more about in their lives than being sort of angry performatively on various platforms, or more important things, things that are pressing, how do I provide for my family? How do I make a living? How do I make sure that the water is safe to drink? That it's generally not these hyper-partisan sites that are able to convince people to subscribe. They may be able to engage with those who already agree with the opinions that they express. But opinion is bountiful, shall we say. I don't think we live in a world in which there's a shortage of strong opinions, whereas reported information that you can count on things that are actually important to you is slightly less bountiful often. And I think it is important to notice here that the news organizations that often are most successful at selling digital subscriptions are generally news organizations that are held in very high regard by many journalists. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Le Monde in France, Dagens Nyheter in Sweden. Many of them are legacy organizations, but not all of them. I think that's important as well. Mediapart in France, Malaysia Kini in Malaysia, then again in Slovakia, 444 in Hungary, Daily Maverick in South Africa. Many of these are newer entrants. And I think what they all have in common is that they have a clear identity that helps them stand out from just stuff on the internet. Some of them are very explicit about who they are for and don't pretend to be for everybody. And I think there is some value in being clear about that. Some of them would say that they are for everybody, but really often in reality, they're for people like me who are relatively affluent, highly educated, and very interested in the news. So I think we are seeing some individual titles that are succeeding, and I think that's encouraging. I mean, not so long ago, a lot of people were very pessimistic about the future of the business of news. The only thing I would say is that if we care about news being for everybody, then there's going to be limits to this model, because there are a lot of people who aren't paying for news and aren't convinced by the news that's on offer right now. And I think, for journalists and news organizations who really believe that news is for everybody, then I think the question is on us is how we can prove that value. And that can be by doing what Meena and Pooja and others are doing, and being very clear about the communities you want to serve, and really being in those communities and tending to the information needs of the people there, and not caring about everybody else. I mean, they're welcome to enjoy your journalism, but that's not really the main target of it. And others will pursue the path that, Ritika and her colleagues at the Indian Express try to do, of a sort of a much broader serving that in principle is for a wider audience, and try to stand out from the sort of constant churn of very ephemeral content and very sort of strongly expressed opinions on the internet. And, I think we need to recognize at the same time this is very challenging, but also I don't think we should be defeatist about this. A lot of the news organizations that are succeeding around the world are news organizations that other journalists are proud of, and would respect and admire, whether they do things for very local communities or for much broader audiences. So I think in that sense, again, I would say that while the challenges are very real, that we can also be cautiously optimistic about it. If I may, one last thing, because the issue of trust and undue influence has come up as well. One thing I always try to keep in mind in these discussions is that both trust and the question of undue influence are very relative. It's relative to people's expectations, and it's relative to what their perception is of other institutions in society. So if people expect relatively little of journalism and news media, perhaps you might think they're too cynical. But if they expect relatively little, then we shouldn't be surprised that many of them will have some trust in organizations to deliver the little that they expect. And similarly, I also think it's very important, perhaps particularly for people like me who live very blessed lives and enjoy many privileges, that I think it's important to recognize also the importance and value of highly imperfect forms of journalism and highly imperfect news organizations. If, for example, your government is systematically underreporting the number of people who died during a pandemic, news organizations don't have to be sort of picture perfect to be able to do really important work on the ground, documenting what's actually going on and how many people are actually dead. It doesn't have to be sort of perfect to be really important. And I think it's very clear in India, but also many other countries around the world, that also news organizations that some more elite journalists might have reservations about have done incredibly important work under very difficult circumstances during the pandemic. And I think we need to recognize the value of that and see the public also engaging with that value.
Great. Thank you so much. Time's up. Thanks everyone really for joining. Pooja from Khabar, Meena from Mooknayak, Ritika from Indian Express, and Ritu from Quint, and of course Rasmus. Thanks a lot for taking out this time. I, for one, will really be thinking about interest in news, because that's something that really I question a lot. And I think fundamentally, if even if it's not alarming, but we have a few people thinking that they need to disengage from news, you're fundamentally disengaging from democracy. And I think that's something that journalists really need to think about when they do the news. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Manisha. Thank you, Rasmus.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.